Hey, thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to be working on this Yamaha 212X. This is a 2018 model. This is a twin engine jet boat with two 1.8 liter motors. Today we're going to be swapping impellers. I'm running this boat at a higher elevation, normally, usually between 5 and 7,000 feet of elevation, and so I'm putting some different pitched impellers that should give me a bit more power at those elevations. So let's go ahead and back this thing into the garage so we can get to work on this. Of course, after you back your boat into your garage, you want to make sure you go ahead and chalk those wheels up. Make sure this thing doesn't go anywhere on you if you're going to go ahead and disconnect it from your truck. Before you start this process of swapping the impellers on this Yamaha 212X, I want you to at least fast forward to the part where you have to remove the impellers from the drive shaft. It is absolutely the most difficult part, and before you tackle this, you want to make sure you have the ability to get that piece done. The rest of it, not so bad, but at least make sure you check out that part before you decide if you want to do this on your own. Now I'm going to start by pulling off the two bolts that are on either side of the reverse bucket. I've got this thrust vector on here which helps with low speed steering, and they're connected to the same bolts that the reverse bucket here uses. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this all off. Again, if you have a stock one, you're not going to have those thrust vectors, but the process is similar with these two bolts. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen these. If you have the thrust vectors on there, this is a 5mm Allen that you're going to unscrew from both sides, and then it has the spring over on the right side. So you just want to get both those pulled off. If this is a stock setup, I believe you have something probably like a 12mm bolt that's going into both sides of that reverse bucket. So anyway, get those bolts pulled off. And in my case with the thrust vector, I'm going to go ahead and yank that thing out of there and get that all pulled off the side, and then we can go ahead and look at the reverse linkage. So up top, you're going to see two bolts that are connected to that reverse linkage. Those two bolts up top are 10mm bolts. So using a 10mm socket, you just want to go ahead and loosen both of those up and take those two bolts out. Now with those bolts pulled up and out, you can now take the entire bucket here and just kind of slide it off. Next step is going to be to remove this linkage that is for the rudder. This is only hooked to the starboard side. So underneath you got a 5/16 Allen with a 17mm nut on top. Now note that this bolt is threaded into the nozzle itself as well as the lock nut. So I'm putting the nut and washer everything back on the bolt so I don't lose any of that. And then I'm just moving that out of the way. Now, next step we're going to go to is this steering linkage right here. And we're going to go ahead and remove that bolt. So the steering linkage bolt uses an 11mm, both top and bottom. So I'm just using a box end 11mm and an 11mm socket. And I'm going to go ahead and remove that bolt. And then once I have that bolt pulled out of there, I can go ahead and move the steering linkage out of the way, and that's going to free up the entire nozzle. Now there are a couple little plastic pieces in there. Make sure you do not lose those. Those two little white plastic things you see there, those do fall out. So be careful, they can fall out. So make sure you don't lose those so you have them available. Again, just to keep from losing bolts and what have you, I'm going to stick the linkage bolt here back through and put the nut back on. Okay, the next step, which is also not a stock feature, but I happen to have these lateral thrusters from Jetboat Pilot installed, which is this piece underneath. Now this has two bolts. There is an Allen bolt that is going through the lateral thruster and acting as the pivot bolt for this nozzle. So you're going to see one underneath, and then there's one on the back left side given I'm working on the starboard motor right here, and it has a bracket going to one of the main bolts, which we're going to remove in a minute. So for now, I just need to remove this bolt from underneath, which is a 5mm Allen, as well as that through bolt over on the left. And that's a 5mm Allen along with a 10mm wrench. So starting with this back bolt, I'm going to go ahead and use the Allen and the 10mm socket and get that one all taken apart. And it doesn't want to push out all the way at first, so I found it's easier to go ahead and loosen that 5mm pivot bolt underneath. You can see it's kind of stuck in there. But as soon as I loosen this one up and the lateral thruster loosens up a bit, then that other bolt comes right out. So there is that little black washer you don't want to lose. And then go ahead and just remove that pivot bolt from underneath, which is the 5mm, and then the whole lateral thruster just moves out of the way. The last step is to remove this top pivot bolt off of the nozzle, and that is a 12mm socket. It's on there a little tight, but it comes out okay. So go ahead and remove that 12mm bolt off the top, and then your whole nozzle is just gonna pull back out of the way. And then when you're done, again, take that 12mm bolt and put it back in place just so you don't lose it. All right, the last thing to do here to remove this is to get this venturi section out of the way, and then we'll have access to the pump. Now there's 4 main bolts, and there's one on each corner. These are 14mm. This one has that bracket from the lateral thruster, but if you don't have the lateral thruster, you won't have that bracket. So you got this bolt, the one up on the top right, and then bottom right. So just grab a 14mm ratchet. You're probably gonna want an extension, and pop all 4 of those loose. Note that these are pretty long bolts, but all 4 of them are exactly the same, so it doesn't matter which one goes where. They're all the exact same bolt. So just go ahead and get all 4 of those removed. Now that those are out of the way, just watch this reverse linkage so you don't catch it on anything, and you can go ahead and pull this entire venturi section out. Now something I do want you to notice is the little pins. There are some little pins that help alignment when you put everything back together. Sometimes those pins stay on one side versus the other, or on one part versus the other, so just make sure you don't lose any of those pins. Okay, now we're ready to remove the pump, which is this big piece here, and which is going to have the impeller. Now note in the back there's these little pry tabs. This might pull off by hand, but you might need to pry it. So there's these 2 little pry tabs in the back, in the bottom right, and there's more in the top left. So what I'm gonna do is just use a screwdriver and see if I can just use those 2 pry tabs and just kind of pry it apart. So I'm just putting my screwdriver in here and just giving it a little pull, and this whole thing's coming loose. So this whole pump is now ready to slide out along with the impeller and the drive shaft. It's all one big unit. You can see there, it just slides right on out, and now you have the entire assembly removed. All right, let's talk a minute on how these impellers get removed. So there's a couple ways to do this, but one you want to do is take with the impeller still on, and it's going to be on very, very tight, you mount it vertically in a bench vise. So this is what I was told to do by a Yamaha tech. You mount it vertically in the bench vise, and then you use the shaft holder, which is that little black tool there, and that is going to go on the end of the drive shaft. So it goes on the spline end of the drive shaft. So again, this is mounted vertically with the drive shaft pointed down. You put that tool on the end of the drive shaft, and then using a very large wrench or a breaker bar, you want to turn the drive shaft counterclockwise to unthread it from the impeller. So turn the drive shaft counterclockwise to unthread it. Now, as I was doing this, I was putting a ton of torque on it, and I ended up doing this. So I actually broke my bench vise in half. That's what ended up giving the impeller did not come loose. So then I was sitting there kind of scratching my head thinking, holy crap, how am I going to get this impeller pulled off if it is on that tight? And I did, again, I verified with the Yamaha service technician to make sure I was turning it the right direction. Anyway, I tried applying heat. I tried applying PB blaster, nothing would loosen that thing up, and then ultimately I broke my vent vise. So I actually ran these things down to a marine shop. They were able to clamp that shaft end, and using a box end 1 1/16 inch wrench, they were able to get somebody to stand on the wrench and actually break this thing free. And so anyway, the shop was able to knock out both of them in like 10 minutes, and that's all I needed was for them to get the old impellers off. So here I am with the impellers done, but again, this part is tricky. This is the absolute hardest part of this entire job because from the factory, those impellers are on very, 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 very tight. So make sure you're prepared for that before you decide to tackle this project. All right, here's the old impeller on the left-hand side with the new impeller on the right-hand side. The stock one doesn't have any markings. There's a black dot, but that was on both impellers, so I'm not sure what that means. I can tell you on the new impellers, which is this one here, they were engraved port and starboard. So you can see it says port, so I know I'm dealing with the impeller for the left engine, or the left side impeller. Anyway, I don't know what the difference is between the port and starboard impellers, but they are marked when you get the new ones. So just make sure you're putting them on the correct side. Now to make sure I got these correct, I even put a little port and starboard. I just wrote with a Sharpie on each one. I'm going to start with some anti-seize paste that I'm putting on the threads so they don't get frozen on there. Started putting the wrench on, but actually you got to put the impeller on first. So again, the orientation is such that I would be turning the shaft clockwise. So I'm actually turning the impeller counterclockwise to get it on. And then I'm going to slide my 1 1/16 inch wrench onto the impeller, put that little holder tool on the end, and I'm just torquing these as tight as I can by hand. Now I figured out actually, after doing my first one, probably the hard way, that the easier way to do the sealant, and you are going to need some sealant. I'm just using some black silicone sealant. You need it to go on both sides of this pump section. And if you do this before, or not, don't try and do the part that's on the boat. Do this, because you can just do one section and rotate it, and you just need to drop this sealant down in that kind of like little groove there. And so you have to do both sides of this pump unit, the side that's going to hook to the boat, and then the side that is going to have the venturi section that goes on afterward. So go ahead and do that while it's out on a bench or on the floor or something where it's easier to get the silicone installed. Don't try and install the silicone on the boat itself. It's also a good idea to go ahead and lube up the spline end of the drive shaft with some waterproof grease. So I'm just slathering on some waterproof grease on the end of the drive shaft for the end that's going to go, back in to meet up with the motor. Okay, as long as you have your sealant on at least one side or the other. Again, when I did my starboard motor, I had it on the other side. With the drive shaft greased up, you're ready to slide this all back together. Do double check that you have the 2 alignment pins that should be on the back side of this pump section. Make sure those alignment pins are in place so that it mates up properly. It takes a little bit of shimming and kind of wiggling around and turning of the impeller a little bit to get the drive shaft to align properly, but then it all kind of just all of a sudden just slides right in where it's supposed to. And you can feel it when it's pressed all the way back. Now, to make sure you have the alignment correctly, one thing to note is that on this particular setup, the water pump for the motor is that little white section. You'll see it should be on the lower left side. So over there on the left side of the pump, that's where the water intakes out of this water pump and pushes it up to cool the engine. So again, make sure you have that oriented so that's on the left-hand side. If you've done that, you have it installed correctly. Next step is going to be to put on the venturi section, and hopefully you've already done the step of putting the silicone on. Again, double check the alignment pins. It's really important that you have these alignment pins correct. Again, there was 2 on the back side and there should be 2 on the front side. Okay, the venturi section is going to go on next. Just careful you don't let that reverse linkage get in your way, but you want to orient it with that bolt on the top. Remember, the bolt should be on the top and the zinc plate should be over on the left. So if you've done that, then you've oriented it correctly. So the venturi section just simply presses right on. Those, as long as you have those alignment pins set correctly, it's going to line up perfectly. And now you're ready to bolt this whole thing back together. All right, you want to just start threading all the bolts in. Again, they don't really matter which one goes where. In the case of mine, I have that little bracket for the lateral thruster. I just need to make sure that's on the bottom left-hand side for the starboard motor. I'm just going to torque these down first with the impact gun, and then I'm going to come back with a ratchet and hit those. Now you want to tighten these to 40 Newton meters, and you want to tighten them with a obviously with a torque wrench, but in a cross pattern. So you want to go crisscross pattern, kind of like you would putting a tire on a car. The only one here I'm not going to tighten all the way right now is that bottom left one, because I'm going to need that bracket kind of loose for the installation of the lateral thruster. So I'm going to leave that one not fully tightened right away. Now we're going to go ahead and install the nozzle. So just make sure again that your reverse linkage isn't in the way, and then we want to remove this 12 mil that's up top. Now I do want you to notice there's this little metal sleeve, and you're going to see that again in a moment. And what the purpose of the little metal sleeve is to go in the hole for the nozzle, and then the bolt goes through that. And the concept here is that we're going to it allows you to tighten the bolt down without binding anything up. So slide your nozzle piece on, make sure you have it oriented correctly, and then there's that little sleeve. You're going to drop that in the hole and then put the bolt down through that hole and thread it into place. Again, that just allows the nozzle to pivot freely and not get bound up when you're steering. So get that top one secured in, and then you want to put your bottom one in. Okay, we get the lateral thruster installed on the bottom. That's going to be the bottom pivot bolt. So we'll go ahead and just get that all put back together. If you are doing the lateral thruster, again, it takes a little bit of finagling to get both the bolts to go in nicely. You want to leave the pivot bolt kind of loose while you reinstall this bolt, and then when you're done, once you have everything at least threaded in, you can go ahead and tighten everything up, including that 14 mil main bolt in the back. You don't want to forget to torque that back down to 40 Newton meters. The next thing to do is going to be to reinstall the steering linkage. Again, this is 11 mil bolt and 11 mil nut. You want to make sure you do not forget those little white plastic pieces that you saw when we took this apart. You want to make sure that you have the little white plastic piece stuck in the top and bottom there when you put this all back together. Next step is going to be the reverse bucket. So you want to get that installed. You want to start with those two 10 mil bolts on top. You want to get those. The bucket goes on top of that linkage, by the way, and then the bolts thread through the bucket and into that linkage. So you want to get those started. They're a little tricky to get started, but once you get them, started in by hand, then you can go ahead and tighten those down. So get the reverse bucket on with those two bolts first, and then you can install these side pivot bolts. And before I do the pivot bolts on this one, because I have the thrust vectors, I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the steering linkage for the rudder. Again, on this model, it has a rudder that links over to the nozzle on the starboard engine. So that threads back in. Again, there's threads cut in the nozzle itself, so you have to thread it. You put a washer in and then thread it through the nozzle, and then tighten that up with a 5/16 Allen. And then there's one more washer on top along with the nut, and that is a 17 mil nut. So go ahead and get that all put back together. Your last real step here is to put those two side pivot bolts back on for the reverse bucket. In this case, I have the thrust vectors, so I'm also reinstalling my thrust vector. So if you have thrust vectors, this is a little more difficult. If you just have the regular bolts, then it's really, really easy. And that's it. That's really the last step you have to do. So once I get that thrust vector reinstalled, everything is back together as it was before we even started the project. Okay, you are done, well, halfway done. At this point, I've done the starboard side, and I get to repeat the installation now on the port side. So twin engine, double the fun, double the amount of work you got to do here. But the second time is really a snap, and you have it done before you know it. So that's it. That's the whole process of swapping your impellers, and hopefully you found this useful. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. And thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.